particular area of vulnerability, and insofar as we have protected ourselves in a particular area of vulnerability, the attention is going to be directed elsewhere. Another example, and you can get more information by watching my international war video. Another instance is that there's going to be a change, right, theoretically, there's going to be a change in, based on security, the more we have secured one vulnerability, so our airlines are pretty secure now, the more we secure one vulnerability, it compromises the security of some other vulnerability. We haven't diverted, we haven't mobilized our security efforts in some other vulnerability because we've spent so much time mobilizing our security in, let's say, air travel, that the threat is then going to change, obviously, from a high degree of security to a low degree of security. So that the idea is, in terms of threat assessment, it's precisely this, right? This is why I love this. Theoretically, it makes sense, right? We recognize where we have attained what we might define as a secure environment as best as possible. And we would have to have some metrics in place to assess the levels of security. And where our security would have been lower in a particular area, we would expect that threat assessment, in terms of a threat assessment, we would expect that external or maybe even domestic agitators are going to target that weakness. It's sort of obvious, right? So in terms, and there's more, but I don't want to overkill because I'm going to discuss this much later in the series. The idea is, in terms of national security, the threat assessment has to be, it's really grounded in the immediacy of the threat, but more importantly than just the immediacy, not even more importantly, but more foundationally than just the immediacy of the threat, the underlying vulnerabilities in terms of national security really have to, and this is undeniable, really have to do with already known, this is known, the things that we know where we're weak. And in terms of where we know that we're weak, our knowledge of our weakness there requires us to secure ourselves in those vulnerable places. That's sort of the basic. And I'm not, again, I don't have time to go into a very technical understanding or discussion of that because it's not off topic, it's just more than needs to be discussed here. So here's the justification. And this is the last bit in section 1. So this is a direct quote. Quote, "One of the most significant flaws of the intelligence cycle is the failure of policymakers to clarify during the initial planning and direction phase exactly what kind of information they need." Right? Ambiguity. So on the right hand, on the right hand of intelligence often remains ignorant. I have to check what this says in the original, the quote. "On the right hand of intelligence often remains ignorant about the left hand of policy deliberations." So basically the idea is the right hand of intelligence, the author defines, and this is, I mean, he sort of arbitrarily picked this, but one aspect of the intelligence community being policy, right hand of intelligence often remains ignorant about what the left hand policy deliberations are doing, right? The relationship between policy and intelligence is that since policy informs, to a great extent, the work of intelligence community members collectively, there isn't always an overlap of information. It's sort of a need-to-know basis, right? So that the very function of the intelligence community is to facilitate knowledge that I would argue they don't necessarily need to know. You need to know as much as you need to know in order to perform your job function. But the idea is that causes some problem. At least that's what the author is saying. I would like to take it a step deeper, right, and recognize that insofar, and I want to end section 1 on this, because I think it's just very clear, insofar as we're talking about the relationship between policymakers on the one hand and the function of the systemic function of the intelligence community on the other, we should recognize that there is a bidirectional influence. Obviously, policy obligates the function of the intelligence community. But as I just demonstrated, in terms of threat assessment, there's absolutely no way, or very, very minimal way, in which you can create policy for things that you don't even know you're vulnerable to. So there's another sense in which the intelligence community informs and influences policy. Why? Because as we're in the intelligence community collecting sourced information, we can infer based on the sourced information that we have, coupled with, and I hope I'm not going too fast, coupled with our existing knowledge of our vulnerabilities, a picture of likely attack. We're probably going to be attacked at this point. Why? Because we know historically we've been attacked at this point, or we know historically that we've been weak in this area, and we know that our enemies know this. Thus, we would imagine that they would try and attack us in this area, not specifically geospatially, or more, because especially now with the internet, you know, in any number of areas. And what we would need to do is we would need to fortify ourselves in this area. Insofar as we fortify ourselves in this area, however, what that does is it sends a signal. This is sort of the relationship between the displacement and substitution effect. Insofar as we fortify ourselves in that area, however, it sends a signal that, hey, these guys are strong. External agitators are probably going to leave and attack someone else, or attack us somewhere else, right? So that we've bolstered ourselves, and our strength deters external agitators from attacking us, so they attack someone else, right? Which would be displacement. In terms of substitution, it would be we've strengthened ourselves in one area, which leaves another systemic vulnerability open, and it's just common sense. If our air travel is now strong, but some other aspect of our national infrastructure, our community, our internet, for the most part, is weak, we would expect to be attacked there, right? So that information is then given to policy, and policymakers can then see how they can change what they expect, what they need, based on the influence from the intelligence community. So it really is a bidirectional influence, right? I don't want to present it as though it was the intelligence community is sort of the handmaid to policymakers. If I were to gauge it, I would say it's maybe 60-40, right? There is obviously policy takes its role, its lead from the mission statement, right? From the governing ideology. This is what America is about. This is what China is about. This is what France is about. England is about. Syria is about. We're about this, X. And that ideological state ideology is going to inform policy and thus inform the intelligence community. But what the intelligence community does and does best and informs others about is the threat assessment. This is what we think is going to happen. Let's see if that's going to be the case and protect ourselves from that external threat. So it's important. The last thing to incorporate is that the way in which, I would argue, the way in which we better make predictions, and I don't know how this is done, but the way in which we better make predictions, especially now with the advent of, you know, just amazing algorithms, you can easily code for this, is to make, in terms of policymakers, right? If you wanted to keep a good checks and balance on how policy influences, if you wanted to put a check on how policy influences members of the intelligence community, there could be, and I don't know that there is, but there could be metrics involved or incorporated that would stagger, rank levels of policy needs, and this data could be historically stored and referenced and used for later threat assessment, right? So again, my presentation style, super duper abstract, way out there theoretical. I mean, it's justified in historical fact. But the idea isn't so much for me to condition the truth, one, because I don't believe in the truth, and two, because I think in presenting this abstractly, generally, it will allow you to make your own assessments, and it will allow what I've said in a very general sense to influence specifically how you're going to approach this data, and I think that's a win-win. So that ends section 1.0 of my analysis into national security and intelligence. I want to thank you for taking the time to watch my videos. I'm Dr. Jason J. Campbell. Thanks, and have a good day.